The stains on the marble floor weren't wine. Nora knew better than to ask, and she knew better than to look the boss in the eye. You survive in this house by becoming a ghost. But ghosts aren't supposed to bleed, and they definitely aren't supposed to catch the attention of men who deal in death. When the man who owned the city called her into his blood-splattered study, she expected a bullet. Instead, she got a secret. Industrial bleach has a smell that gets into the back of your throat and stays there. It tastes like copper and cheap mint. Nora knelt on the imported Italian tile of the foyer, a rough yellow sponge in her gloved hand, working at a dark, tacky smudge near the baseboard. It was 4 a.m. The Costello estate was entirely silent, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the central air conditioning and the occasional crunch of gravel outside as the perimeter guards walked their routes. Nora kept scrubbing. Up and down, hard, circular motions. You didn't ask questions at the Costello estate. That was the first rule the housekeeper, an iron-spined woman named Beatrice, had given her. You see nothing. You hear nothing. You are a ghost with a mop. If you can manage that, you get paid in cash every Friday. If you can't, you don't leave. Nora had a lot of debt. A brother who thought he could outsmart a sports bookie, a hospital bill from her mother's last days, and an eviction notice that had pushed her back against a very hard wall. So she became a ghost. For 6 months, she had polished mahogany tables, stripped blood-soaked sheets from guest beds, and scrubbed the grout until her knuckles ached. She kept her head down. She wore her drab grey uniform like armor. Heavy footsteps sounded on the grand staircase. Nora didn't look up. She kept her eyes locked on the tile, her breathing steady. The heavy thud of leather boots grew louder, stopping exactly 3 feet away from her kneeling form. The scent of rain, stale cigar smoke, and something sharply metallic filled the air. Gunpowder. You missed a spot. The voice was low, entirely devoid of the aggressive posturing most of the men in the house used. It was a tired voice, a voice carrying a weight that was crushing its owner. Nora stopped scrubbing. She didn't stand. Standing would mean meeting his eyes, and you didn't look Roman Costello in the eye. Not if you wanted to keep breathing. She shifted her gaze slightly to the left, locating a tiny speck of dried red she had overlooked. "My apologies, sir," she said. Her voice was flat, practiced. She pressed the sponge into the tile, wiping the speck away. Roman didn't move. He stood there, his shadow falling over her. Nora could see the hem of his tailored trousers. They were charcoal grey, impeccably pressed, but the left cuff was damp with something dark. "Go to bed, Nora." She froze. Her heart gave a singular painful thump against her ribs. He knew her name. Roman Costello, the head of a syndicate that controlled the eastern seaboard, a man who barely spoke to his own lieutenants, knew the name of the girl who scrubbed his floors. "I have to finish the hallway, Mr. Costello," she murmured, keeping her head bowed. A long exhale rustled above her. It sounded like a man letting go of a breath he'd held for a decade. "The hallway can wait until the sun comes up. Go to bed." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order quietly delivered, but absolute. Nora nodded, once a sharp, jerky movement. She gathered her plastic bucket, the heavy scent of bleach wafting up as the murky water sloshed against the sides. She pushed herself to her feet, keeping her gaze pinned to the middle button of his ruined suit jacket. She walked away, her rubber-soled shoes silent on the marble. She didn't look back. But as she turned the corner into the servants' corridor, she could feel his eyes on her spine. Heavy. Calculating. The next 3 days were a masterclass in tension. The house felt like a loaded spring. SUVs with tinted windows arrived at all hours. Men in sharp suits and broken noses filed into Roman's private study, emerging hours later looking pale and sweating. Voices were kept low, but the hostility bled through the thick oak doors. Nora navigated the estate with practiced invisibility. She emptied ashtrays filled with half-smoked Cuban cigars. She replaced crystal whiskey decanters that had been drained in a single afternoon. She cleaned. She erased the physical evidence of their stress. On Thursday evening, the tension broke. It didn't break with a shout or a gunshot. It broke with an eerie, suffocating silence. The SUVs left. The guards pulled back to the perimeter. The house emptied out, leaving only the skeleton crew of staff and Roman himself. Beatrice found Nora in the laundry room, folding heavy linen towels. "The study needs to be turned over," Beatrice said, her face tight. "He's still in there. Don't speak. Just empty the bins, polish the desk, and get out." Nora nodded. She loaded her small wooden cart with a fresh microfiber cloth, a bottle of wood polish, and a trash bag. She pushed the cart down the long, dimly lit western wing. The floorboards here were older, covered in thick Persian rugs that absorbed the sound of her approach. She paused outside the heavy double doors of the study. She raised a hand and knocked twice, softly. "In." Nora pushed the door open. The study was cavernous. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, packed with leather-bound volumes that looked like they had actually been read. A fire crackled in the massive stone hearth, casting dancing, erratic shadows across the room. Roman sat behind his desk. He had discarded his suit jacket. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows. His forearms were thick, corded with muscle, and marred by a fading, jagged scar that ran from his wrist to his ditch. He had a glass of amber liquid in one hand. The other rested flat on the desk right next to a heavy black handgun. Nora kept her eyes averted. She pushed her cart toward the leather sofas near the fireplace, starting with the ashtrays. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the popping of the fire. Nora worked quickly, her hand steady, despite the cold knot of anxiety sitting in her stomach. She wiped down the glass coffee table. She fluffed the crushed leather pillows. She was hyper-aware of him. He wasn't moving, but the sheer gravity of his presence filled the room. He was watching her. Nora moved to the desk. This was the most dangerous part, intruding on his immediate personal space. She approached the side of the massive mahogany structure, pulling a fresh cloth from her apron. "Excuse me, sir," she whispered. She reached for the empty glass tumbler sitting on the corner of the desk. As her fingers closed around the glass, Roman moved. His hand shot out, catching her wrist. Nora gasped, her muscles locking up instantly. His grip wasn't crushing, but it was immovable. His skin was rough, calloused, and radiating heat. She finally looked at him. Roman's face was a study in hard angles, a sharp jawline covered in dark, rough stubble, high cheekbones, and eyes that were so dark they looked pitch black in the firelight. They were bloodshot, etched with profound exhaustion. He stared at her face, his gaze tracing the lines of her jaw, the slight parting of her lips. He wasn't looking at her like a predator looks at prey. He was looking at her like a drowning man looks at a piece of driftwood. "You don't shake," he said, his voice a low, gravelly scrape in the quiet room. "Sir," Nora breathed, afraid to pull her arm away, afraid to leave it there. Every man who sat in those chairs today was shaking, hiding it, but shaking. Roman's thumb brushed lightly over the erratic pulse jumping at her wrist. "But you don't." "Why?" "I don't have anything you want, Mr. Costello," she answered honestly. "There's nothing for you to take from me." A dark, bitter smile touched the corner of his mouth. He released her wrist slowly, as if reluctant to let go of the warmth. "Everyone has something to take, Nora." He stood up. He was a tall man, imposing, and when he stood, the room seemed to shrink. He picked up his glass of whiskey and walked around the desk. He didn't look back to see if she was watching. He knew she was. He walked over to the far wall, a solid panel of dark oak, located between two towering bookshelves. He stopped in front of it and leaned his shoulder against the wood. He looked at her over his shoulder. The firelight caught the sharp, dangerous glint in his eye. "Come here," Roman whispered. "Let me show you something." Nora didn't move immediately, her survival instincts honed by a lifetime of bad hands, and worse men screamed at her to grab her cart and back out of the room. A mob boss doesn't invite a maid to look at his secrets unless he plans on making sure she can never share them. But there was something in the way he stood. A slight slump to his broad shoulders, a profound, bone-deep weariness that stripped away the terrifying myth of Roman Castello and left only a very tired, very dangerous man. She set the dirty glass back on the desk. She wiped her damp palms on her grey apron and closed the distance between them. Her footsteps made no sound. She stopped 2 feet away from him, close enough to smell the scotch on his breath and the sharp, clean scent of cedarwood soap on his skin. Roman reached out and pressed his palm against a specific knot in the dark oak paneling. There was a soft, hydraulic hiss. The wood shifted, sliding backward, and then smoothly to the right, revealing a thick pane of glass. Nora frowned, stepping closer. The glass was dark tinted. She looked through it and felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. It was a two-way mirror. It looked directly into a small windowless room she had never seen before. The walls were lined with soundproofing foam. The floor was bare concrete, sloped slightly toward a drain in the center. Sitting in the middle of the room, strapped to heavy metal folding chairs, were 3 men. Nora recognized them. They were the men who had been sitting on the leather sofas in this very study just hours ago. Roman's capos. The men who practically owned the city docks. They looked terrible. Their expensive suits were ruined ties discarded. One of them had a swollen eye that was already turning the color of crushed plums. They were arguing violently, their faces twisted in anger and fear, though no sound penetrated the thick glass. Nora stopped breathing. Her hands gripped the fabric of her apron. "Look at them," Roman murmured. He stood so close behind her she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. 3 of the most powerful men in the state. They have politicians on speed dial. They have millions in offshore accounts. He took a slow sip of his whiskey. And right now they are selling each other out for a chance to walk out of that room. Ratting on their brothers, their cousins. Lying. Begging. Nora watched the capo in the middle, a heavy-set man named Sal, spit on the man to his left. The silent violence of it was jarring. "Why are you showing me this?" Nora asked. Her voice was steady, but it sounded thin to her own ears. "Because," Roman said softly, "in this entire house, in my entire world, you are the only person who isn't trying to lie to me." He stepped up beside her, looking through the glass at the ruined men. "You come in here, you scrub the floors, you clean the blood off the baseboards. You don't pretend it's dirt. You don't pretend I'm a saint. You just clean it." He turned his head, looking down at her. "You see exactly what I am, Nora. And you don't flinch." Nora forced herself to look away from the men in the box. She looked up at him. His eyes were searching hers, looking for the lie, looking for the angle. "I don't flinch because I need the job, Mr. Castello," she said flatly. "I'm not brave, I'm broke." Roman laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, utterly devoid of humor. "Honesty. It's a rare commodity. I value it." He reached out. His knuckles brushed against her cheek. Nora stiffened her breath, catching in her throat. His touch was incredibly gentle, a stark, jarring contrast to the violence happening on the other side of the glass and the gun resting on his desk. "They stole from me," Roman said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. His fingers drifted down to the curve of her jaw. $2 million from the port shipments, but it isn't the money. It's the disrespect. It's the disease of ambition. Nora's mind raced. He was making her complicit. By showing her this, by telling her this, he was tying her to him. She wasn't just the maid anymore. She was a witness. What happens to them? She asked the words, slipping out before she could stop them. Roman's thumb stroked her jawline once slowly before he pulled his hand away. The loss of heat left her skin feeling cold. You know what happens, Nora. He turned away from the glass and pressed the wooden panel. It slid shut with a definitive click, sealing the violent, silent men away. The study was just a study again. Clean the desk, Roman said, his tone shifting back to the authoritative, distant rhythm of the boss. He walked over to the fireplace, leaning his arm against the mantelpiece and staring into the flames. Nora felt like the air had been let out of the room. Her knees trembled slightly, but she locked them. She walked back to her cart, grabbed her cloth, and moved to the desk. She wiped down the mahogany. She avoided touching the gun. She picked up the empty tumbler. She worked in silence for 10 minutes. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the clinking of ice as Roman poured himself another drink. When she was finished, she pushed the cart toward the door. Nora. She stopped her hand on the heavy brass doorknob. She didn't turn around. Yes, sir. When you clean that room tomorrow, Roman said, his voice trailing across the distance between them. Use the industrial bleach. The concrete holds stains. Nora closed her eyes. A cold shudder racked her spine. Yes, Mr. Costello. She opened the door and walked out into the dimly lit hallway, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind her. She stood in the corridor for a long time, staring at the intricate pattern of the carpet, trying to slow the violent hammering of her heart. She was no longer a ghost. He had seen her. He had brought her out of the shadows and placed her right in the middle of his bloody world. The smell of copper hit her before she even opened the door. It was 6 a.m. The house was waking up. Beatrice was in the kitchen aggressively yelling at the bread delivery man in rapid-fire Italian. Paulie, the day shift guard, was drinking coffee on the back patio. Nora stood in the sub-basement. She had a heavy yellow bucket in her hands, filled with a brutal mixture of hot water and industrial bleach. She wore thick rubber gloves that went up to her elbows. She unlocked the heavy steel door and pushed it open. The concrete room was empty. The 3 folding chairs were gone. Nora set the bucket down. She didn't look at the walls. She kept her eyes on the floor. There was a large, dark, sticky pool near the drain in the center of the room. It was already beginning to dry, flaking at the edges. She dropped to her knees. She grabbed her stiff-bristled scrub brush, dipped it into the scalding, chemical-laced water, and went to work. You see nothing. You hear nothing. She scrubbed. The water turned a pale, sickening pink, then a deep, muddy crimson. She rinsed the brush. She scrubbed again. Her mind kept replaying the night before. The weight of his hand on her wrist, the smell of cedarwood, the quiet, devastating way he had said, "You know what happens, Nora." She felt sick. Not from the blood she had cleaned blood before. She felt sick because she realized with a terrifying clarity that she wasn't entirely repulsed by him. When he had touched her cheek, she hadn't wanted to pull away. She had wanted to lean into the warmth. She was losing her mind. It took her 2 hours to get the concrete pristine. By the time she poured the red water down the drain and flushed it with clean water, her arms were trembling from exertion. She stripped off her gloves, her hands sweating, and pruned and locked the room behind her. When she carried her supplies back up to the main floor, the atmosphere in the house had shifted again. The heavy, suffocating tension of the previous few days was gone. It had been replaced by a quiet, terrified efficiency. The staff moved quickly. No one spoke loudly. Sal and the other two capos were missing, and everyone knew what that meant, even if no one dared say it out loud. Nora was putting her bucket in the utility closet when Beatrice appeared in the doorway. The older woman looked pale. "Leave that!" Beatrice snapped her voice tight. "Go to the dining room." Nora paused, a bottle of glass cleaner in her hand. "I haven't finished the East Wing bathrooms. The boss wants his coffee. He specifically asked for you to pour it." Nora's stomach dropped. This was a violation of the established order. Beatrice poured the coffee, or Maria. The maids did not serve Roman directly during breakfast. It was a visible elevation of status, and in a house like this, elevation meant a target on your back. "Me?" Nora asked quietly. "Don't make me repeat myself," Beatrice hissed, stepping forward and grabbing Nora by the elbow. "I don't know what you did, girl, but you better walk a very narrow line. Men like him don't have favorites. They have temporary distractions, and when they get bored, the distractions disappear." Nora swallowed hard. She set the glass cleaner down. "I haven't done anything. See that you don't." Nora walked down the hall, smoothing her apron. Her hands felt cold. She entered the formal dining room. It was a massive space, dominated by a long cherry-wood table that could seat 20. Roman sat at the head of the table. He was dressed in a sharp navy suit, his hair neatly combed back. He looked immaculate. The exhausted, vulnerable man from the study was gone, replaced by the polished, impenetrable armor of the Don. 3 of his remaining lieutenants sat at the table with him. They were eating quietly, eyes darting toward Roman every few seconds. A silver coffee pot rested on a warming tray on the sideboard. Nora walked over to it. She could feel the eyes of the lieutenants on her. They were wondering who she was, why the boss had specifically called for a scrub girl. She picked up the heavy silver pot. She walked over to Roman's right side. "Good morning, sir," she murmured, keeping her eyes on his empty porcelain cup. "Morning, Nora," Roman said. The entire table went dead silent. The lieutenants stopped chewing. Roman never used the staff's names. Never. Nora's hand shook slightly. A tiny drop of dark coffee splashed onto the pristine white tablecloth. She froze. A stain. She had made a mess right next to his hand. In the mob, mistakes were punished, often brutally. The lieutenant stared at the small brown spot as if it were a bomb. Nora quickly reached into her apron for a cloth. "I'm sorry, sir. Let me get that." Roman reached out and caught her wrist, just like the night before. But this time, it wasn't in the privacy of the study. It was in front of his men. His grip was firm, halting her movement entirely. "Leave it," he said smoothly. He didn't look at the stain. He looked up at her. His dark eyes locked onto hers, entirely unbothered by the audience. "It's just a little mess, Nora." Roman said, his thumb brushing over the inside of her wrist, right over her wildly beating pulse. "We can always clean it up later." The double meaning hit her like a physical blow. The concrete floor in the basement. The blood. He was reminding her of their secret. He was telling his men without a single direct word that she belonged to him. Nora couldn't breathe. She looked into his eyes and saw the sheer, terrifying possessiveness there. "Yes, Mr. Costello," she whispered. He released her wrist. He picked up his cup and took a sip of the black coffee. Dismissed. Nora backed away from the table. She turned and walked out of the dining room, her legs feeling like lead. She had survived by being invisible, but Roman Costello had dragged her into the light and marked her with a stain that bleach would never wash out. She was trapped, and the most terrifying part wasn't the danger surrounding him. The terrifying part was that, as she walked back into the silent halls of the estate, She could still feel the phantom heat of his touch burning against her skin. By noon, the house knew. They didn't know the details, they didn't know about the two-way mirror or the concrete floor, but they knew the boss had touched a maid in front of his lieutenants. That was enough. In the Costello estate, attention was currency, and Nora had just bankrupted the entire staff. When she walked into the sprawling industrial kitchen to drop off the morning rags, the low hum of Spanish and Italian conversation snapped shut. It was like someone had thrown a circuit breaker. 4 maids and 2 prep cooks stared at the stainless steel counters, suddenly intensely fascinated by their work. Maria, a girl Nora had shared cigarettes with on the back steps, picked up a tray of polished silver and walked out without making eye contact. Nora walked to the laundry chute. She pushed the heavy door open and shoved the bleach-stained rags down the throat of the metal pipe. She felt the isolation settling over her skin like a second layer of dust. She was infected now, contagious. To associate with her was to draw the eye of the boss, and nobody here wanted that. She turned around and nearly collided with a solid wall of grey wool. Nora took a sharp step back, her heel hitting the baseboard. Dominic stood in the narrow alcove between the pantry and the chute. He was Roman's new number 2, elevated automatically by the sudden absence of Sal. Dominic was 30, built like a prize fighter, and wore suits that cost more than Nora would make in a decade. He also had a smile that made her skin crawl. "Careful," Dominic said, reaching out to steady her. His hand clamped around her upper arm. His grip was entirely too tight. "You're a little jumpy today." Nora kept her eyes focused on his expensive silk tie. "Excuse me, Mr. Russo. I need to get back to work." She tried to step around him. Dominic stepped into her path, closing the distance. He braced his free hand against the wall beside her head, trapping her in the alcove. The smell of peppermint and stale cigarette smoke washed over her. "What did you do exactly?" Dominic asked. His voice was pitched low, a conspiratorial whisper that carried a heavy edge of threat. "I don't understand the question, sir." "Bullshit." Dominic leaned closer. "Roman doesn't look at the help. He doesn't even know the help's names. Then this morning he's putting his hands on you over a spilled cup of coffee. What did you tell him?" He thought she was a rat. He thought she had overheard something while cleaning and fed it to Roman. The paranoia in the house was already mutating. "I poured the coffee," Nora said, keeping her voice completely flat. "I spilled it. He stopped me from cleaning it up. That is all." Dominic's jaw ticked. He squeezed her arm tighter, a painful bruising pressure. "Sal is gone. Tony and Paul are gone. The boss is cleaning house, and suddenly you're standing at his right hand. If you're playing a game, sweetheart, you're playing at a table way out of your league. I wash the floors, Mr. Russo. I don't play at any table. We'll see." Dominic stared at her for a long, ugly second. Then he released her arm, stepping back and smoothing the lapels of his suit. "Just remember, the boss gets bored. And when he does, you still have to live in this house, with the rest of us." He turned and walked out of the kitchen. Nora leaned back against the wall. Her knees were shaking a fine, violent tremor she couldn't suppress. She reached up and rubbed her arm where his fingers had dug into the muscle. She wasn't just a ghost who had been seen. She was a ghost who had been dragged into a crossfire. 10 minutes later, Beatrice found her in the linen closet. The housekeeper didn't yell. She didn't offer a scolding. She simply handed Nora a small brass key. "What is this?" Nora asked, staring at the heavy metal resting in her palm. "West wing." "3rd floor," Beatrice said grimly. "You don't clean the basement anymore. You don't clean the guest rooms. You clean his suite and you clean the study. That is it." Nora's stomach plummeted. "Beatrice, please, I just want my normal rotation." "Your normal rotation is gone," Beatrice snapped, finally showing a crack of genuine anxiety. "He requested you, exclusively. You don't talk to the other girls. You don't linger in the kitchen. You do his rooms and you go to your quarters. God help you, Nora." The housekeeper turned and walked away. Nora looked down at the brass key. It wasn't a promotion. It was a lock turning on a cage. Roman Costello's private suite was nothing like Nora expected. She had anticipated the garish luxury of a mob boss. Velvet drapes, gold fixtures, oversized oil paintings. Instead, the third-floor suite was stark, minimalist. It felt more like a bunker dressed up as a penthouse. The walls were painted a cool slate grey. The furniture was dark leather and heavy oak, practical and devoid of ornamentation. There were no photographs, no personal mementos. It was a room entirely stripped of a past. For 3 days, this was her entire world. She vacuumed the thick rugs. She changed the heavy linen sheets on the massive king-sized bed. She cleaned the black marble bathroom. She didn't see Roman. He left the suite before she was permitted to enter at 9 in the morning, and he didn't return until long after her shift ended. But she felt him. His presence lingered in the faint scent of cedarwood soap in the shower, in the half-empty glasses of scotch left on the nightstand, in the way the heavy blackout curtains were always drawn tight against the sun. On the 4th day, the routine broke. Nora was in his study, the private one, attached to his bedroom, not the one with the two-way mirror downstairs. She was dusting the heavy oak desk when she noticed a manila folder sitting dead center on the leather blotting pad. Normally she wouldn't look. She had survived this long by keeping her eyes blind to his business, but the name printed on the tab of the folder caught her eye, freezing the blood in her veins. David Mercer. Her brother. Nora dropped the dustcloth. Her hands were suddenly clammy. She looked at the heavy door leading to the hallway. Closed. Quiet. She opened the folder. Inside was a stack of hospital bills from her mother's final weeks. Staggering numbers. Tens of thousands of dollars. And beneath those, a ledger of gambling debts David had racked up with a local bookie operating out of the South Side. The bookie was a known associate of the Costello family. Across the bottom of the ledger, a heavy black stamp had been pressed into the paper. Paid in full. Nora stared at the red ink. It didn't make sense. The debt was suffocating her. It was the reason she scrubbed blood off concrete. It was the reason David was currently hiding in a motel in Ohio. "He owed $60,000, a voice said from the doorway. Nora violently flinched, slamming the folder shut. She spun around. Roman was standing in the doorframe. He had his suit jacket slung over one shoulder, his tie loosened. The bruising exhaustion under his eyes was worse today. He walked into the room, tossing the jacket onto a leather chair. The hospital was another 40. Roman continued walking to a small wet bar in the corner of the room. He poured an inch of amber liquid into a glass. 100,000 total, a lot of weight for a girl making $20 an hour with a mop. Nora's chest heaved. She gripped the edge of the desk behind her. "Why do you have this?" Roman turned around, leaning back against the bar. He took a sip of his drink. He didn't look angry that she had looked. He looked like he had left it there, specifically for her to find. "I like to know who is in my house, Nora," he said simply. "I ran a background check on you 3 months ago. I knew about the brother. I knew about the bookie. You paid it." Her voice was a cracked whisper. "I wiped the bookie's ledger. The hospital was a simple wire transfer." He set his glass down. "David can come back to the city. No one is going to break his legs. The debt is gone." Nora didn't feel relief. She felt a cold, creeping horror working its way up her spine. In her world, in his world, money was never a gift. It was a leash. "I can't pay you back," she said, her voice shaking now. "I will never make that kind of money, Mr. Costello." "You know I can't." Roman pushed off the bar. He walked slowly across the room. Nora's grip on the desk tightened until her knuckles went white, but she didn't step back. She held her ground as he stopped inches away from her. He reached out. This time he didn't grab her wrist. He gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered on her jaw. "I don't want your money, Nora," he said softly. "Then what do you want?" "I want you to stop calling me Mr. Costello." He stepped closer, invading her space completely. The heat of his body was overwhelming. Nora tilted her head back to look at him. His dark eyes were intense, heavy, with a hunger that had absolutely nothing to do with violence and everything to do with possession. "You didn't free me," Nora whispered the cynical truth, tearing out of her before she could stop it. "You didn't save me. You just bought my paper." A slow, dark smile curved his lips. It was a genuine smile. It completely transformed his face, making him look devastatingly handsome and utterly lethal. "I told you," Roman murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her bottom lip. "You never lie to me. You see exactly what it is." He leaned in his mouth, hovering a fraction of an inch from hers. She could taste the scotch on his breath. She felt the heavy, inevitable gravity pulling her in. "You belong to me now, Nora," he whispered against her lips. "Understand how?" Nora closed her eyes. The cage door clicked shut. "Yes." The violence didn't announce itself. It rarely does. It was 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. Nora was asleep in her small room in the servants' quarters. The rain was lashing heavily against the single window, masking the sounds of the estate. Her heavy oak door slammed open. Nora jolted upright, ripping the thin blanket to her chest. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs. Paulie, one of the night guards, stood in the doorway. He looked panicked. His black suit was soaked with rain, and his breathing was jagged. "Get up!" Paulie barked. "The boss wants you." "What?" Nora blinked against the harsh hallway light pouring into her dark room. "Now it's 2 a.m. "I said, get up," Paulie snapped, stepping into the room. "He's in the main study. He won't let the doctor in. He told me to get you. Now move." Nora scrambled out of bed. She pulled on her grey uniform dress over her sleep shirt, her fingers fumbling blindly with the buttons. She shoved her feet into her rubber-soled shoes and ran past Paulie into the corridor. The house was awake. Guards were moving quickly through the halls, speaking in harsh, clipped tones into earpieces. The tension was thick, suffocating. Nora ran down the main staircase and sprinted toward the west wing. She reached the heavy double doors of the main study. Dominic was standing outside, arguing viciously with an older man holding a black medical bag. He said, "No, Doc." Dominic yelled, his face flushed. "You go in there, he'll shoot you himself. Just wait." Dominic turned and saw Nora. His eyes narrowed. He looked at her with a mixture of intense disgust and total confusion. He stepped aside, grabbing the handle of the door. "Go," Dominic ordered, "before he bleeds out on the rug." Nora pushed past him. The study was dark. The fire hadn't been lit. The only light came from the small desk lamp in the corner. Roman was sitting on the leather sofa. His jacket was gone. His white shirt was completely unbuttoned, and the entire left side of his body was drenched in dark, slick crimson. The blood was pooling on the expensive leather, dripping heavily onto the Persian rug. He had his head thrown back against the sofa, his eyes closed. His breathing was shallow and wet. A heavy crystal tumbler of scotch sat on the floor near his boot. His gun was resting on his right thigh. Nora clamped a hand over her mouth to muffle a gasp. Roman's eyes snapped open. Even clouded with pain, they were razor-sharp. He saw her, and let out a ragged breath, letting his head loll forward. "Lock the door," he rasped. Nora turned her hands, shaking so badly she could barely turn the heavy brass deadbolt. It clicked with a loud thud. She turned back to him. "You need the doctor," Nora said, her voice cracking. She walked toward him, her shoes sticking slightly to the blood, already soaking into the carpet. "Roman, you're bleeding to death." "Lock the doctor out," Roman muttered. He winced, a sharp hiss of pain escaping his teeth as he tried to sit up straighter. Dominic set it up." Nora froze. "What?" "The meat. At the docks." Roman coughed, and a thin line of blood ran down his chin. He wiped it away with the back of a trembling hand. It was an ambush. Dominic sold the route. The reality of his world slammed into her. The paranoia, the constant, suffocating fear. He couldn't trust his own men. He couldn't trust his own doctor. He could only trust the ghost. "There's a medical kit," Roman breathed, gesturing weakly to the bottom drawer of his desk. "Bring it." Nora didn't argue. She ran to the desk, yanked the heavy drawer open, and pulled out a large, tactical black bag. She carried it to the sofa and dropped to her knees in front of him. The copper smell was overwhelming. It was the basement all over again, but this time the blood belonged to the monster. She unzipped the bag. Gauze saline, a staple gun, sutures. "Show me," Nora ordered. Her fear vanished, replaced by a cold, clinical survival instinct. Panic wouldn't keep him alive. Roman pulled the ruined white shirt away from his side. It was a bullet graze, but it was deep. A jagged, ugly tear along his rib cage, about 5 inches long. The muscle was exposed, bleeding heavily. It hadn't hit an organ, but it was tearing him apart. "You have to clean it," Roman whispered, his eyes locked on her face. "Then staple it. You have steady hands, Nora." "This is going to hurt," she said. "I know." Nora grabbed a bottle of sterile saline and a thick pad of gauze. She leaned in her knees, pressing against his boots. She poured the saline over the wound. Roman didn't scream. His entire body went rigidly, terrifyingly still. His jaw locked the muscles popping in his neck, and his right hand gripped the handle of his gun so hard his knuckles turned white. But he didn't make a sound. Nora worked quickly. She wiped away the blood, exposing the raw, angry flesh. Her hands were covered in his blood. It was warm, sticky, and intimately horrifying. She grabbed the surgical staple gun. "Hold still," she commanded softly. She pressed the cold metal to the top of the wound. She looked up at his face. He was sweating his skin, pale and clammy, but he was staring right back at her. The barrier between them was completely gone. In this dark room, surrounded by betrayal, he was utterly vulnerable to her. She held his life in her bloody hands. "Do it," he breathed. Nora squeezed the trigger. Click. Roman flinched his breath, hissing out. Click. 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 She worked down the line of the wound, pulling the torn flesh together. The metallic snapping of the stapler was incredibly loud in the quiet room. By the time she finished, her shoulders ached from the tension. She taped a heavy bandage over the closed wound. She sat back on her heels, breathing hard, her hands resting in her lap, stained entirely red. Roman let out a long, shuddering exhale. He let his head fall back against the sofa. For a long time, the only sound was the rain hitting the window and their synchronized heavy breathing. Then Roman reached out. His hand, covered in his own blood, found hers. He gripped her fingers tightly. He didn't pull her toward him. He just held on, anchoring himself to the only solid thing he had left. "Thank you," he whispered to the ceiling. Nora stared at their joined, blood-soaked hands. The line had been crossed. She wasn't just the maid he had bought anymore. She was the one keeping him alive. And as she sat there in the dark, She realized she was willing to kill whoever had tried to take him from her. She squeezed his hand back. "I've got you," she said. Fever smells like old copper and sour sweat. By noon the next day, the private suite on the 3rd floor had become a pressurized tomb. The heavy blackout curtains were drawn shut against the harsh July sun, plunging the room into artificial twilight. Roman was burning up. The staples had held, but the sheer trauma of the blood loss and the dirty graze of the bullet were fighting a war inside his body. He lay on the heavy linen sheets, his chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged bursts. Nora hadn't slept. She sat in a straight-backed wooden chair beside the bed, a bowl of ice water in her lap. She wrung out a white washcloth until her knuckles popped, then leaned forward, pressing the damp cloth against his forehead. Roman groaned, turning his face into her palm. The heat radiating off his skin was terrifying. Downstairs, the house was eating itself alive. Dominic was running the floor. He hadn't called a doctor. He hadn't sent any of the loyal men to check on the boss. Instead, he had cordoned off the 3rd floor, posting 2 of his own hand-picked guards at the base of the stairs. He was waiting for Roman to die. It was a silent, bloodless coup happening right beneath their feet. A sharp knock rapped against the heavy bedroom door. Nora froze. Her hand rested on Roman's burning chest. "Open up, Nora." It was Dominic's voice, muffled by the solid oak. "I need to speak to the boss." Nora's stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. She looked at Roman. He was unconscious, his jaw slack a sheen of sweat covering his collarbones. He couldn't protect her. He couldn't protect himself. She stood up. She set the damp cloth on the nightstand. She walked to Roman's discarded trousers, reached into the holster, and pulled out the heavy black handgun. She didn't know how to shoot, but she knew how to hold it. She walked to the door. She didn't unlock the deadbolt. She leaned her forehead against the wood. "Mr. Costello is sleeping," Nora said. Her voice was perfectly steady. The tremor that usually lived in her chest was entirely gone, replaced by a bizarre, icy calm. "Wake him up," Dominic ordered. The doorknob rattled violently. "We have a shipment at the docks that needs a signature. If he's conscious, I need him. He left explicit orders not to be disturbed under any circumstances. Not even by you, Mr. Russo." A heavy silence fell over the hallway. She could picture Dominic standing there, his expensive suit perfectly pressed, weighing his options. He could kick the door in. But if Roman was awake, if Roman was sitting up with a gun aimed at the door, Dominic would be a dead man before his body hit the floor. The uncertainty was the only thing keeping the door on its hinges. "You're playing a dangerous game, sweetheart," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "When he kicks it, you're the only one left in that room. You think I'm going to let the maid walk out with the family secrets?" "I don't know any secrets," Nora said softly. "I just clean the stains. I'll see you soon, Nora." Heavy footsteps retreated down the hall. Nora let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her knees buckled slightly, but she caught herself against the doorframe. She looked down at the gun in her hand. It was heavy cold and entirely real. She walked back to the bed. Roman's eyes were open. They were glassy with fever, but they were tracking her. He looked at the gun in her hand, then up to her face. "You didn't open the door," he rasped. His voice sounded like cracked gravel. "He wants you dead," Nora said, setting the gun on the nightstand right within his reach. She sat back down in the wooden chair, picking up the washcloth. "I know." Roman turned his head, wincing as the movement pulled at his stapled side. "The safe behind the mirror. The combination is 0419. Nora stopped moving. She stared at him. There's a go bag inside. Roman continued, forcing the words out through shallow breaths. 300 grand in unbanded cash, 2 passports. If my fever breaks 99, or if Dominic breaches the door, you take the bag. There's a service elevator at the end of the hall that drops into the garage. You take my car, and you don't stop driving until you hit Canada. He was giving her the exit, the ultimate severance. He had bought her debt, and now he was giving her the means to vanish. Nora looked at the brutal, scarred man bleeding into his expensive sheets. She thought about the tiny, cramped apartment she had been evicted from. She thought about the men who had hunted her brother, the relentless, grinding poverty that had forced her to her knees to scrub another man's floors. She thought about the way Roman had touched her cheek in the study, looking at her like she was the only real thing in a world built on lies. "I don't know how to drive a stick shift," Nora said flatly. Roman blinked. A weak, rough sound escaped his throat. It took Nora a second to realize it was a laugh. "You're an idiot," he whispered, closing his eyes. "Drink this," she ordered, lifting a glass of water to his lips. "You have to break the fever, because if Dominic comes through that door, I am going to shoot him, and I don't think I can drag his body to the basement by myself." Roman drank. He rested his head back on the pillows. The corner of his mouth twitched upward. 0419, he repeated softly, slipping back into unconsciousness. Nora dipped the cloth back into the ice water. "I'm not leaving, Roman." It took 36 hours for the fever to break. When Nora woke up in the armchair in the corner of the room, her neck stiff and her uniform permanently wrinkled, the bed was empty. Panic seized her throat. She shot out of the chair. "I'm here." Roman was sitting at his desk near the window. He was dressed. Black trousers, a black button-down shirt left open at the collar to accommodate the heavy bandaging beneath. He looked pale, gaunt, and entirely lethal. The vulnerability of the sickbed had evaporated. The Don was back. He was methodically loading a spare magazine for his sidearm. Click, click, click. The sound of brass sliding into steel. "How do you feel?" Nora asked, taking a hesitant step forward. "Like I got shot," Roman replied dryly. He slammed the magazine into the grip of the gun. He looked up at her. The dark intensity in his eyes pinned her in place. "You stayed." "I stayed." "You had the combination. You had a head start. Why?" Nora crossed her arms over her chest. The cynical armor she had worn for years felt heavy, useless. She dropped it. "Because the world outside this house is just as bad as the world inside it. Out there, I'm prey. In here..." She swallowed hard. "In here, you look at me." Roman stood up. He moved slowly, favoring his left side, but his steps were deliberate. He walked across the room, stopping directly in front of her. He reached out, sliding his hand to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in the messy hair at the base of her skull. "In here," Roman said, his voice a low, vibrating hum. "You are mine, and nobody touches what is mine." He kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was aggressive, possessive, a sudden explosion of pent-up adrenaline and lingering fever heat. Nora gasped against his mouth, her hands flying up to grip the lapels of his open shirt. She kissed him back with equal desperation, tasting the sharp bite of scotch and the metallic tang of survival. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathing hard. "Go downstairs," Roman ordered his thumb, tracing her swollen bottom lip. Nora blinked, disoriented by the sudden shift. "What?" "Dominic called a meeting in the main study. He thinks I'm dead or close enough to it. He's going to ask the remaining capos to formally back him." Roman stepped away, picking up his gun from the desk. "Go to the study. Tell them you need to clean the ashtrays." "They won't let me in." "Dominic will. He wants to see you break. He wants to see the look on your face when he takes my chair." Roman slid the gun into his shoulder holster. Go into the room. Stand by the fireplace. When I tap the glass twice, you press the panel. Nora's blood ran cold. The two-way mirror. He was going to use the secret room. They have guns, Roman. If you walk out of that wall, they won't have time to draw, Roman said coldly. Do you trust me? She looked at him. The man who had bought her debts. The man who had bled on her hands. The man who had just kissed her like the world was ending. Yes. 10 minutes later, Nora pushed her wooden cleaning cart down the first-floor corridor. The house was dead quiet. The air felt thick, charged with static electricity. She reached the heavy double doors of the main study. Two of Dominic's guards stood outside. "Get lost!" one of them barked. Mr. Russo requested fresh water and clean ashtrays. Nora lied smoothly, keeping her eyes downcast. The door opened from the inside. Dominic stood there, a smug, oily smile on his face. He looked at Nora, then at his guards. "Let her in," Dominic said. "Let the girl do her job." Nora pushed the cart into the cavernous room. It was a nightmare repeating itself. 3 capos sat on the leather sofas. Dominic walked past them, rounding the massive mahogany desk, and sat down in Roman's leather executive chair. Nora moved to the sofas. She picked up an empty tumbler. Her hands weren't shaking. "As I was saying, gentlemen," Dominic announced, leaning back in the chair and steepling his fingers. "The Costello era is over. Roman is weak. He's bleeding out upstairs because he didn't have the foresight to see a shifting tide. We need leadership that understands modern logistics. Not an aging dog holding on to old grudges." The capos shifted uncomfortably. One of them, an older man named Vincent, cleared his throat. "We don't know he's dead, Dom. If you take that chair and he walks down those stairs—" "He's not walking anywhere," Dominic sneered. He looked directly at Nora, who was wiping down the glass coffee table near the fireplace. "Isn't that right, Nora? Tell the gentleman how the boss is doing." Nora stood up. She held a damp rag in her hand. She looked Dominic dead in the eye. "The boss," Nora said evenly, "is exactly where he needs to be." Tap. Tap. The sound was incredibly faint, coming from the solid oak paneling directly behind Nora. Nobody heard it but her. Without breaking eye contact with Dominic, Nora reached behind her back. She found the hidden knot in the wood. She pressed it hard. The hydraulic hiss was deafening in the quiet room. Dominic's smug smile vanished. He bolted upright in the chair, his hand scrambling for the gun tucked into his waistband. The capos shouted, jumping up from the sofas. The heavy oak panel slid back. Roman Costello stepped out of the wall. He didn't look sick. He looked like the devil incarnate. He raised his right hand in one fluid, practiced motion. The gunshot was deafening. It tore through the acoustics of the room, vibrating against the spines of the leather-bound books. Dominic's head snapped back. A spray of red painted the large oil painting hanging behind the desk. He slumped forward, his body hitting the mahogany desk with a heavy final thud. The room erupted into chaos. The 3 capos reached for their weapons, but they froze. Roman had his gun leveled directly at Vincent's chest. "Sit down," Roman commanded. His voice wasn't loud, but it possessed absolute, crushing authority. The men slowly raised their hands, dropping back onto the leather sofas. Their eyes were wide, darting from the smoking barrel of Roman's gun to the dead man bleeding out over the blotting pad. Roman didn't look at them. He walked slowly out of the hidden alcove. He walked past the terrified capos. He walked directly to Nora. She was standing perfectly still, the damp rag still in her hand. Her ears were ringing from the gunshot. Roman stopped in front of her. He reached out and gently took the rag from her fingers, tossing it onto the floor. He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. He turned to face the room. He held her hand in full view of his most powerful, violent men. Dominic sold our route to the Albanians. Roman said, his voice cold and flat. He organized the hit at the docks. He is a traitor. And as of this moment, anyone who questions my authority or questions the authority of the woman standing beside me will join him on that desk. Are we clear? Vincent swallowed hard, his eyes glued to the massive pool of blood expanding across the mahogany. Clear, boss, Vincent croaked. The other two nodded frantically. Good, Roman said. He looked down at the dead body. Get this garbage out of my house, and burn the desk. It's stained. The industrial bleach sat untouched in the utility closet. It was 3 a.m. The Castello estate was entirely silent, but it wasn't the suffocating, terrifying silence of the past. It was a clear, sharp quiet. The rot had been cut out. Nora sat on the edge of the king-sized bed in the third-floor suite. She had taken off the grey maid's uniform. It lay in a crumpled heap on the floor near the door, discarded and abandoned. She wore one of Roman's black button-down shirts, the fabric swallowing her frame, pooling halfway down her thighs. Roman stood by the window, a fresh glass of scotch in his hand. He was looking out over the manicured grounds, watching the perimeter guards walk their routes in the dark. He turned and looked at her. The debt is gone, Roman said softly, breaking the silence. Dominic is dead. The house is secure. The money in the safe is still yours if you want it, Nora. You can walk out that door right now, and nobody will ever look for you. Nora looked down at her hands. The fingernails were short, practical. Her knuckles were permanently dry from months of harsh chemicals. She had survived by being invisible. She had survived by keeping her head down, swallowing her pride, and scrubbing other people's sins away. But Roman had seen her. He had stripped away the invisibility. He had handed her a gun. He had kissed her with the taste of blood in his mouth. He hadn't just saved her from her debt. He had destroyed the version of her that was willing to be a victim. "Do you want me to leave?" Nora asked, looking up at him. Roman walked across the room. He set his glass on the nightstand. He knelt on the floor in front of her, ignoring the protest of his stapled wound. He reached out and took both of her hands in his. "I am a violent man, Nora," he said, his dark eyes entirely devoid of deception. "I live in a violent world. If you stay, you aren't just staying in this house. You're stepping into the blood. You will never be clean again." Nora looked at the rough, calloused hands holding hers. She looked at the man who commanded an empire kneeling at her feet. She let out a soft, cynical laugh. "Roman," she whispered, leaning forward until her forehead rested against his. "I haven't been clean a day in my life." She pulled her hands free from his grip. She reached up, framing his sharp jaw, her thumbs tracing the dark stubble on his cheeks. "Burn the uniform," Nora said, her voice dropping into a dark, resolute murmur. "I'm not scrubbing your floors anymore." Roman smiled. It was a devastating, terrifying thing full of sharp edges and absolute devotion. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her down off the edge of the bed and into his lap, burying his face in the crook of her neck. "Whatever you want," the boss whispered against her skin. "It's yours." The ghost was dead. The queen had arrived. Nora traded her mop for a crown, proving that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one nobody notices. She didn't just survive the mafia. She conquered it from the inside out. What did you think of Nora's ultimate transformation? Did she make the right choice, staying with Roman, or should she have taken the money and run? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this dark, gripping romance, smash that like button, share the video with your friends, and hit subscribe for more intense storytelling.